Hello and welcome to the top 10 most likely unseen issues for the February 2016 operational case study exam, which is on cake and dessert manufacturer First Class Bakery. So before we start, I'm just going to go through a bit of an introduction to this particular video and where I've got the information on and what you need to do with said information. So how have I come up with these top 10? Well, first of all, you look at the focus in the pre-scene. If there's a lot of material in the pre-scene on a certain topic, then it's likely that there is some kind of importance of that topic. It's likely to be brought up in the exam, so there's more to talk about. And that feeds into the second point here, the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. But that particular section extends beyond purely what's in the pre-scene, but also what CIMA like to examine. For example, ethics. It may be that there's no real mention of ethics in the case study, but ethics is considered very important by CIMA, and therefore they are likely to examine it. Next is the strategic importance. How important is it to the organization? If a certain topic is very important to the company, for example, say their suppliers. If they rely very heavily on a certain supplier, then it's likely that there might be an issue on the supplier. If something were to happen to that supplier, what impact could that have on the business? And also, just a more general experience in doing these videos in creating mock exams and reviewing exams in the past, the typical kind of issues that come up, and what kind of things have the examiner brought up in the past. And my final point here is about how easy it is to write issues on that subject. The people who write the exams are obviously people too, and they will go for ones that they know, that they can write good questions on. So what do you need to do for these issues? Well, first of all, it's important to prepare key models. So this will be things like your SWOT exam, like SWOT analysis, like your pestle analysis. Because building up this information now will help you to adapt the new information given you in the unseen, or help you to have that context to apply the unseen material. Next thing you need to do is practice exam questions on these issues. This will help you to understand the kind of questions that will be asked around these topics and how to answer them. And also, this next section here, it will help you to plan these answers in your mind so that when you go into the exam and you start writing, you'll already have a background in which to apply this new information. You'll already have certain points to bring up in your head as you're writing for them. And I've also put some more generic things here, such as the advantages and disadvantages of these certain topics, where they would be used and how models can be used to support them. So let's move on to the top 10 issues now. So my first issue here relates to funding. So why have I chosen funding? Well, for starters, it's a key topic, it's a key financial F-pillar topic. And there's a lot that you can talk about, such as the differences between equity funding, debt funding, how the dividend policy of the organization affects it. And another reason why funding is very important is it's often used as part of another question. So you might be given some information on a new project or a new development, and so the question will then be about that development, but then you'll have an additional part at the end about how that project is going to be funded. And it's a very commonly examined topic, not just at operational level, but also at management level and at strategic level. So what kind of issues often come up when it comes to funding? Well, there's the ones that I've already mentioned there, such as the purchasing of a new machinery, purchasing of another company, acquiring another company, new technology, and what kind of methods are there to raise finance. And the reason why I've specifically chosen these ones here is because they are relevant to the pre-scene. There was a lot of information about possibly or leading you to believe that there could be a question on purchasing new equipment or about updating the vans, and also about purchasing newer, smaller companies to help break into that branded market. Also, funding would be very important because of the current cash flow within the organization. Currently, their cash flow is at zero and they're actually into an overdraft at this point. So raising money could be an important issue here. Now, dividend policy, perhaps not as likely in this exam because they are a owned subsidiary. However, dividend policy could be relevant when it comes to how much money goes to Universal Foods and how much goes to Frank Mitchell. Could it be that more of that money could be reinvested into this specific business rather than going to the parent company? So what kind of things should you raise when answering a question on funding? Well, for starters, there's the main point here that in 2015 the cash flow was negative. Therefore, there's not going to be any real cash available for investment at the moment without raising more money. And of course, budgeting for this cash flow is incredibly important, and getting it right is incredibly important. Now, why didn't they budget more effectively? Why didn't they realize that they would go into debt? When they decided to pay $700,000 billion of that loan off, that long-term loan off, why didn't they realize that that would make their cash flow for that year negative? So what other things could we bring up here? Well, their gearing has been reduced as a result of paying off that loan to 30%, which is a big difference compared to the 47% that it was the year before. So perhaps that does leave extra room for increased debt funding. There was also quite a lot of assets on the balance sheet, and so they could be used both as they could be sold outright to raise money, or they could be used to secure extra debt against. And so this is my suggested order of raising funds. So which ones are the best ones to use, which ones are the most likely that you would use, and which ones you wouldn't, but they're all important to mention anyway. So obviously the first one is wherever possible you should just use cash that you have. However, as we know, they currently do not have any. So it could be that the company's management needs to speak to the board at Universal Foods about securing extra funding from their central finance department. Now, if this is not possible, there's obviously the chance of using debt funding. So this is where you borrow money essentially from a bank. And they've got a significant asset base that they could use as security for this, or they could sell those assets outright, as I've already mentioned. And when you're talking about selling assets, you should look for ones that perhaps are not consistent with the company's strategy. Now, we weren't given too much information about the strategy, but we can read into the way the organization works in that it values the quality of its cakes, and its main core business function is to create cakes. So anything that would perhaps mean they couldn't make cakes as effectively would not be an ideal asset to sell. But assets that have no relation to that could be. And finally, equity. Now, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for First Class Bakery themselves to make to raise finance through equity because they are an owned company. They are a subsidiary company. However, Universal Foods themselves is a listed company, so could potentially raise money on the Dividend stock market if necessary, if Universal Foods' finances themselves are not great, but they still need to give more money to First Class Bakery. And finally, the kind of theories that you could use. Dividend signaling is not too important at operation level, but I will go through it anyway. This is essentially where paying out a dividend may look like you do not have any new projects to invest in. So you are just paying off the profits, which obviously looks bad from an investor perspective if the company does not seem to be going anywhere. And then the more common one of perhaps the advantages of debt versus equity and vice versa. So debt funding is a lot quicker and usually more cheaper in the long run, or in the short run at least. whereas equity is perhaps more difficult to raise, and it does mean you have to surrender control of some of your company. However, unlike interest payments, which will lead to an increase in financial costs, paying off dividends is often optional. So you do not necessarily have to always pay the money back. So my next one here is risk management. And the reason why I've brought up risk management is it's a very important P1 topic and has been regularly examined. In fact, was examined quite extensively in the past few case studies. And also the fact that there seem to be several risks identified within the pre-CIMA, but there was no information on how these risks are controlled. Now, an example of that would be the credit control issue that the company has. They have a 30-day limit for credit for all customers, and yet many customers don't adhere to this. And it was evidenced from the receivable days that on average it takes almost a week or more longer for customers to pay. And they don't even have anyone who's trained in credit control to help mitigate this. So likely issues here. So identify the key risks in a specific project. So if you have some information on a new project, it might give you a list of all the advantages of it, but then you also have to think of the disadvantages of it. What if the project were to fail? Where would the financial state of the company be if this project were to fail? Also on the general project management of this project. Now, for a project to be successful, it has to be managed effectively by people who are skilled, and they have to have the right resources to make that project come to life. So will this current project have these resources that are required? And if not, what are the risks as a result of that, and how can we mitigate those risks? And also the kind of various methods of reducing risks, such as the COSO risk methodology, and also the audit committee. Now, as a subsidiary company, there was less of a board, less issues surrounding governance, but it did appear that they didn't have any kind of internal audit facility which could help mitigate the effects of risks, or could identify risks that have not yet been identified. So the key points that you must raise when talking about risks are the things outlined in the pre-CIMA, such as the fluctuating demand for things like special occasion cakes and fluctuating demand from the smaller retailers. Often they would go a while without buying, and then they might buy a lot. So how do you plan your production around that? And then smaller scale suppliers. The issues with smaller companies is they may often fail to meet increases in demand if they can only produce a certain amount at once. There's also the risk that they may collapse at any given moment. Then you have issues with exchange rate, which is a usual currency risk. Now, we know that that they do not trade outside of Beeland at the moment, but they do source some ingredients from outside of Beeland. And then you also have your more health and safety risks and your emissions risks as well. We know from the pre-CIMA that the company's vans barely passed emission standards, but also there is talk about the government increasing the emission standards, and what kind of impact could that have on the organisation. And so theories that you can use. Of course, you've got the COSO risk methodology here, and you can see I've given you a diagram here. You could take a risk and follow through these steps. So internal environment, objectives, event identification, and so on. Work through that, apply the particular risk to each of those steps. Then you've got the TARA risk management model, such as transfer, accept, reduce, and avoid. And this is all how you combat a risk. So let's take a look at those four then. So if we were talking about transfer, that could be something like outsourcing our delivery. Now we know there's a risk regarding emissions. Our vans currently only just pass it, and there's a risk that the emission standards may increase. So we could outsource this delivery function, and then we transfer that emissions risk to the outsourced company. It's then up to them to ensure that their vehicles meet emission standards. Accept, so this is where you just accept it as being part of operating in the industry that you are in the environment, the country that you are in. So this could be some sort of health and safety thing. You have to accept that there is always a degree of risk for employees working around heavy machinery. You can do your best to stop anything from happening, and that of course could be a reduce thing here. You could reduce the risk as much as possible, but ultimately you may have to accept some risk that comes from that naturally. And then the final one is avoid. So this is where you just avoid the risk altogether by perhaps not entering into that particular market, by not taking that particular project forward. An example of this could be setting up an exporting section of the business into another country. There's obviously risks that come with that. Will the consumers within that country like your product? Will they buy your product? Do you have issues with transporting your product out there? But you can avoid all of those risks simply by not going into the market.